This episode of Shadiversity is brought to you by my stupendous, awesome, legendary supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support Shadiversity on Patreon, visit patreon.com/Shadiversity.
Shadiversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and I want to talk to you about an interesting kind of question and discussion that comes up now and then in the medievalist community, or many facets of the medieval enthusiast community, whether it's fantasy, HEMA, reenactment, the whole gamut. And it's the question of, can we be knights in the modern day, or can knights exist in the modern day? I have come across both categorical yes and a categorical no in regards to this discussion. And I'm not really sure what my own opinion is, though a couple of things do come to mind, and I kind of realise, well, it's clearly a matter of perspective. Depending on what your perspective is, the answer will be no, and depending what it is, it's right. And which perspective is correct? Well, they both kind of are, which means it's both right and no, and it depends where you want to fall. And so the first thing about this is, what do you consider to be a knight? If a knight is distinctly a type of soldier that existed in the medieval period that swore loyalty to a noble lord and tried his best to follow what he understood to be chivalry, or his lord understood to be chivalry, because it was a very subjective thing, well then knights can't exist in the modern day because they are a medieval thing, okay? It's a medieval knight, and if you take it out, this thing outside of that historical context, there's no longer knights. And this is interesting because I've had this discussion on another video where I do kind of explore this question somewhat, but instead of the modern day, I'm talking about the pre-medieval period. Did knights exist before the medieval period? And in that video, I did take the stance, and I kind of have, more evolved my opinion to be more solidly that when referring to a medieval knight, it needs to be a type of warrior that specifically exists in the medieval period to avoid confusion. And the types of warriors that existed in other time periods and other cultures that were very, very comparable to what a knight was, whether it's a more simplistic definition of a knight as a soldier on horseback, because that was kind of the genesis meaning of the term knight. Well, that also depends on the type of language used. Gee, this can be a complicated thing. All right, knight originally didn't mean horseman, okay? It was chevalier that meant horseman, but that was the French word for knight. The English word for knight comes from the word connect, or necht, I don't know how to pronounce it, which means bondsman or bond servant. But of course it was adopted to refer to these soldiers that are on horseback. See the confusion? And I actually love the confusion because I find it mentally stimulating when you think about all these facets and elements to the discussion. Now, in this sense, okay, if a knight is distinctly a medieval type of warrior, so we can have an important distinction between the types of warriors that existed in medieval Europe as opposed to the very similar warriors that existed before then and after and in other cultures. Because if you define a knight simply by what they did, separate to culture and time period, well then, according to that definition, a samurai can be a knight. Or the cataphracts could be knights as well. They're very similar, and funny, the cataphracts are more like the mounted soldiers, but the samurai are more like the soldiers that swore, fealty to a higher lord and followed a very significant code of conduct that have a lot more similarities than differences, looking at chivalry and bushido. But there is a very important need to have a distinction between knights and samurais, because even though they have a lot of similarities, there's a lot of big differences. The cultural thing, for one, they existed in two different parts of the world, and so calling them both knights and both samurai, no, it doesn't work. Good distinction is important, and to keep that distinction, you then need to add this time period and cultural period to what a knight was. And if that is the proper distinction of a knight, well then no, it's impossible to have knights in the modern day because knights only existed in the medieval period and after it. But what about modern knights? Because knighthood is a thing that still exists. So then it switches whole things up completely. Well, clearly that's something completely different. And that is defined by someone who has received a knighting by the state. Now, it doesn't, usually it's a monarchy, doesn't necessarily have to be, not according to my basic understanding, because there are several monarchies, not just Britain. But I'm part of the Commonwealth, I live in Australia, and knighthoods, there are knighted Aussies, and there are this is something that the British, crown still does to this day. Because the concept of knighthood has clearly evolved over time. It started as a more military kind of thing, and evolved to a more even governmental, but then more social honorific in society. But compare the two. These modern knights, in the sense of people who have been knighted, they are very different to medieval knights. They're not equivalent. In fact, there's a larger difference between modern knights, like in the sense of people with knightings, than there are a difference between samurais and knights. A samurai is far closer to what a medieval knight is than a modern day person who has a knighthood. And so what right do we have to call them knights when we can't call samurai knights? See the difference? So clearly, there are different types of knights. And I do think it is important to make a distinction between people, modern day people who have been knighted compared to medieval knights because of the whole military soldier element. And also the chivalry side. Chivalry was taken quite seriously in the medieval period, but we misunderstand what chivalry is. I've made a whole video on it. It's kind of highly required watching if you want to be really engaged in this discussion to know. Brief summary doesn't do it justice. You really should watch the whole video. I do encourage you. Chivalry is a subjective thing, and there are interpretations of chivalry that outright contradict other interpretations of chivalry. It doesn't mean that it wasn't taken seriously. It very much was. It was referred to in literature, in conversation, the regular person to the highborn person. They all had an idea of what chivalry was in their own mind. And if you became a knight, you wanted to follow chivalry, whatever chivalry happened to be to him or the lord he served. More often than not, it was the lord he served. But in the modern day, this important component of chivalry has kind of been taken away, yet not. Because there is a modern day almost interpretation of chivalry, and there's the say, like, and it's more about being a gentleman, He was very chivalrous and kind of thing like that. But the difference is with modern day knighthoods, there isn't this expectation that people who have been knighted should be chivalrous, okay? But back in the day, that kind of went hand in hand. Chivalry effectively meant all those qualities that an individual or a group of people subjectively believed made a good knight. These qualities that made a knight good at his job. And if that was being a jerk killing peasants, that was chivalrous. If it was protecting peasants, that also was chivalrous. It was subjective, but it was fundamentally those qualities that the individual subjective person saw that made a knight good at being a knight. That connection doesn't exist with chivalry today. We even say that people can be chivalrous without being knights, and people can have knighthoods without swearing to follow chivalry or even giving a toss about it. So like I said before, the actual answer to this question is that there's more than one type of knight. And if you want to think of yourself as more in line with the classical medieval knight, well, first of all, modern knightings don't mean spit. You don't need to worry about that. But some people have believed if you do what a knight does, and one of the things is a knight was a soldier, but people have kind of push that aside a bit and say, no, look at the jousting, okay? The duels, the competitions and stuff like that. And that was a very classical thing about knighthood, seeking glory in competition against other knights, and they would go in the great tournaments. And so there are some competitive kind of sports organizations that are brought up, around and structured around medieval combat, and they call their combatants knights. Now, there's been criticism lobbed against them calling them a knight, and like I said, I think it's a matter of context. If you're trying to say that these guys are the same as medieval knights, that's bullcrap. No, they're not. But if you're trying to say, well, they're a type of knight because it's a word and we're adopting it and they're doing kind of things like knights, I actually don't have too much of an issue with that because language is a thing that evolved, and if you want to create a new type of knight, as long as you're making a distinction that they are not absolutely equivalent or the same as, say, a medieval knight or even a modern day person who has a knighthood, all power to you. In fact, it's already been done. The Jedi Knight. Now, they don't exist in the real world, but it's a distinction, a separate kind of knight that is being created in pop culture that we're perfectly happy to accept, and no person is getting confused between a Jedi Knight and a medieval knight, but they use the word knight in the sense that these are warriors that are trying to follow an important or higher ideal, even though I have more issues with the Jedi Knight kind of ideal. They're not nearly as righteous as, they propose to be. Like, seriously, denying all emotion? Being completely emotionless? And as, Obi-Wan said, only a Sith deals in absolutes, which means the Jedi don't believe in being absolutely good. They don't deal in absolutes. Anyway, Jedi. So for myself, I don't have too much of an issue with modern day reenactors or people who are doing reenactment, say mock combat type things, calling themselves knights as long as there's a distinction there. For instance, they could call themselves an SCA knight or a HEMA knight, or someone pretending to be a medieval knight, but pretending, okay? To say you are a medieval knight is to try and say that you live in the medieval period following chivalry, sworn to a higher lord, making your living through your profession as a full-time soldier, or even part-time soldier. Part-time soldiering did kind of exist in the medieval period and stuff like that because lords were knights as well, and there's a couple of different confusing things about it as well. And in actual fact, if someone wants to call themselves a knight based on the, foundation that they are trying to follow what they see as a chivalric ideal, and you live your life accordingly, you probably have more ground to call yourself a knight if you're, also, throw the sword, use a sword somewhere in there as well. You probably have more grounds to call yourself a knight than certainly the people who've received knightings in the world. So I can't hold too much against people like that.
Words are appropriated all the time, and knight as a word has remained in the English language and has evolved as well, to the point where, in actual fact, if you were to try and define what a knight is in the modern day, you would have to look to modern day knightings, because that's what it currently is. So much so that when referring to knights of the medieval period, you really do need to use that prefix, a medieval knight, as opposed to what knights have evolved into in the modern day, which of course is a very far cry. And then it comes down to what people want to consider is the real knight. Is it the modern knight, or is it the medieval knight? And this is very much a subjective thing, which means there's basically no definitive answer. But to find the answer for each individual, for you, for me, it's a simple matter of asking ourselves, what image is conjured in our mind when we say, think of a knight? Now, for me, whenever someone says that, I think of a medieval knight, not a modern day knight, which is just a regular Joe who's received a knighting. And because of that, whenever I think of what the word knight means, I think of the actual, real, authentic, historical knight of the medieval period. It's just that people who've received knightings are legitimate knights and have claim on the word itself as much as calling historical knights knights. It's just that they are not the same thing. The thing is though, for myself, and I'm sure for many of you and many people in the world, the awesomeness of the real medieval knight is so cool that many of us simply want to be knights because it's awesome. Who wouldn't want to be a knight? Now, we can't be an authentic medieval knight because we don't live in the medieval period, and we'd be pretty darn stupid to try and fight in modern day combat the way that knights fought in the medieval period. You don't bring a sword to a gunfight, unless you run out of ammo. So it might be useful just, holding a sword with you for a backup. I know that's dumb, but honestly, if I ever went to war, I'd still want to carry a sword with me just in case. I reckon a sword is a better weapon than a bayonet. I'm getting distracted. What I'm basically trying to say here is that it's fundamentally impossible to resurrect the true combative art of the knight in real military combat. The only way to try and bring back this combative art is in sport, not in warfare. And so reenactment groups like the SCA or Battle of Nations, they actually come as close as you probably can come to medieval knight-like combat in the modern day. Because if you want to experience what it might have been like to be a real medieval knight, you basically have to create the closest approximates that you can get away with in the modern day. You'll never have a perfect analogue. But because of that, I feel that the closest analogues to what knights were in the medieval period actually have far more justification to claim that glorious title of knight than anyone else, including those people who have an official knighting under a crown. Yet up to this point, I've only been talking about the combative side of what knights did. To come close to even having a type of claim to be something close to what a medieval knight was, you need to follow chivalry. And this is a tricky one because I've already mentioned chivalry was subjective. There were some interpretations of chivalry that was simply being a really, really good fighter. And in that sense, if you're good at fighting in the medieval way, you could be considered chivalrous in that sense. But chivalry became a much more noble ideal, even in the medieval period, but it wasn't a universally noble ideal. That's the key point. In fact, the ones that had a larger influence on what the individual knight would think of as chivalry was their lords, the knightly order they served, and their local society. If a knight did something that he and his lord both felt was perfectly fine, but the society at large frowned upon deeply, especially if a higher authority frowned on it, say a church official who could make things difficult for the lord, or indeed a high lord or king, that could have negative repercussions, and no matter how much the knight and his lord proclaimed them to be chivalrous, if a larger majority of people thought that they were not, they really can't fight against that greater subjective view of what chivalry is. Remember as well that societal standards changed between geographical locations and countries, and so what one society felt was very chivalrous, another society might very well not. But the interesting thing about this is that in our current society, there is a standard in what is perceived to be chivalrous. And that's very interesting. And even if, say, it's very different to what medieval societies felt was chivalrous, because chivalry is a subjective thing, the modern standard of chivalry is actually as valid as the past. And this is where I think chivalry can actually be reclaimed in a more knightly concept, even in the modern day. Anyone can claim to be a knight, but if they're not doing those things that knights did, they're not going to have too much credibility. The way you can more officially have some measure of a claim to the concept of knighthood is if you created a kind of new type of knighthood that you would have authority over. For instance, say you created an organization, and I'll use an example, Shadiversity. Shadiversity is a brand that I have ownership over, and if I wanted to give out the right for people to call themselves a Knight of Shadiversity, I then have essentially created a new type of knight. It's not a medieval knight, it's not a Jedi knight, it's not a Battle of Nations knight or an SEA knight, it's a Shadiversity knight. And whatever qualifications I stipulate that one needs to fulfill to be a Shadiversity knight essentially becomes the code of chivalry for this new order of knighthood. Because chivalry means doing those things that make you good at being a knight, and this code of conduct that I set forward for someone to be a good Shadiversity knight or Knight of Shadiversity becomes chivalry, as I've just mentioned. But if I wanted to respect what the societal standard of chivalry is at the same time, I would probably want to include those elements of chivalry as well, and I actually think the modern standard of chivalry is a wonderful thing. I think it's great for men to act gentlemanly, and indeed chivalrous. And so a code of conduct by any other organization can actually be quite accurately called a type or version of chivalry. Specifically, the type of chivalry for that type or order of knight. And that's actually a rather authentic usage of the concept of chivalry. And in my opinion, it works quite well.
A lot of things to think about in this subject. Those are my thoughts on it. I hope you've enjoyed. Share your own thoughts in the comments below. I look forward to reading them. And until next time, farewell.